It is now getting serious. This is the macro, geopolitical and regulatory challenges for crypto finance. The moderator for this is our wonderful friend, formerly from the Financial Times, now Bloomberg. Please welcome Eva Szalay.
I often get the sense at crypto conferences that central banks are kind of viewed as the bailout, entities that bail out failed businesses, and that's all they do. Is that true, Eswar? What do they do?
Far from it. I do hang out with a lot of central bankers, and their primary objectives are to ensure monetary and financial stability, which is an important part of providing the right sort of infrastructure for an economy to grow well. So the provision of money, the provision of credit is essential to fuel economic activity, and to make sure that that is done in a sustainable and safe way is the critical aspect of what central banks do. But of course, you also need to think a little bit about the plumbing that underlies what central banks do, which requires a financial system that works well. So that involves a lot, from the creation of credit to management of risk, to management of liquidity, to making sure that productive resources are flowing to the right parts of the economy. So central banks are ideally in the position to not be noticed when things are going well. But I think in the last couple of decades in particular, we have come to a place where central banks are seen as essentially the saviors who step in when most other policies are not working very well. So unfortunately, they have taken on a role that I think does not serve them well, because ultimately central banks can work well when they have a limited set of objectives, clearly defined instruments that they can use to accomplish those objectives. But when the objectives start multiplying and central banks are seen as the saviors of last resort, I think it puts them in a very uncomfortable position, makes them subject to political pressures, and actually creates a much less effective central banks. And that, I think, is why central banking has gone awry in the last couple of decades in particular.
Yeah, it's like the fiscal and monetary policy, they're in a choir, and if fiscal policy goes off key, then the central bank governor sort of has a choice: go off key with fiscal and where you're not supposed to be, or stay on key, and then there's a bit of dysfunction, right? But I think I would say, to the positive, for the last couple of decades, central banks have really established their independence from governance. And I think, actually Ronald Reagan gets a lot of credit for that, because, when Volcker really slammed the US economy into recession by raising rates, Ronald Reagan left him alone to conduct monetary policy in an independent way. And that's been a very important, I think, global evolution.
So is there a real sort of regime change now? And then if we think about crypto and Bitcoin, which is only 13 years old, is there a sort of fundamental shift in how central banks influence the crypto sphere? Because now they're going the other way, rather than just, being the suppliers of free money.
In some important ways, yes. What underlies the value of crypto as assets is, I think, a very important question. But one sense that cryptos are essentially going to be immune from macroeconomic fundamentals, especially the policy environment, perhaps that cryptos will serve as inflation hedges. I think those questions have come up in the last few years, and there was a sense that this is an asset class that is going to play by different rules, but also is going to be governed by different forces. That, I think, has not quite panned out. If anything, what we have seen, especially over the last year, but again, as Staci pointed out, in different cycles, is the fact that crypto does seem to behave much like other risky assets. And then when you think about crypto and what the valuation model is underlying crypto, at least to me, it's far from obvious. If you think about a corporate bond or an equity, you sort of know that it represents the discounted value of future earnings of that company. With crypto, it's far less obvious, especially if you think about a crypto such as Bitcoin that was intended to be a medium of exchange, that is not working very well as a medium of exchange, where a lot of the value seems to be coming from the proposition that its technology and also the scarcity inbuilt into the framework is going to preserve its value. So this is an asset that has turned out to be very risky, just like other risky assets. And given that there isn't a clear valuation model, I think it's subject to even more volatile swings than other risky assets, which is what we're seeing.
Can I stick up for crypto
Please do, yeah.
a little bit? Okay, so, you have to think about, I think, inflation in two ways. One is monetary inflation, and the other is price inflation. Monetary inflation tends to precede price inflation, of course. And the monetary inflation that we have right now came from the fiscal stimulus. So in the United States, a country which I'm of course most familiar with, we had 2.3 trillion in stimulus under Trump during the core part of the pandemic, and then another 1.9 trillion under Biden. So that's a lot of fiscal stimulus. That is sort of broad money supply inflation. And during that time, Bitcoin was on a tear. So in a way, you can think of Bitcoin as a hedge of that monetary supply inflation. And it's maybe not fair to ask Bitcoin to be a hedge of the price inflation, which comes after monetary supply inflation. And then the second way, so I don't know, but that's a theory that I think is worth considering. And the second thing is just in terms of your point on kind of equity valuations and the inflation having an effect on what the Fed is doing or what central banks are doing to raise rates, what that effect is on markets. If the base rate, so if the risk-free rate is low, then that's a very kind of risk-on environment, right? Because then you have to seek equities and other high-risk, higher-return assets, right? And it's easy to do. You're looking for yield, but it's also your hurdle rate is lower. So if your risk-free rate is 1% and you're looking for an additional 4% yield, it's not sort of that hard to find it. But if your risk-free rate is up now, at 5% and you're looking for another, 4% in yield, those of you who have Texas Instrument calculators, you might want to get them out now, but you have one always in your pocket, so in case anybody needs one. Your discounted cash flows model, that discount rate is higher, and so the valuation of riskier assets is going to get lower. It's kind of just math, right? The interesting thing there is, though, that there is this sort of valuation effect, but there's also an earnings effect, right? And so as earnings start getting compressed because of inflation, right? Supplies get more expensive, it all kind of gets more difficult. What assets are not valued based on earnings? Well, that's like Bitcoin, crypto, gold, right? So the earnings piece of that equation is much more subdued, I would say, in that valuation equation than, say, equities would. So, if you're looking for, I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this, but if you're looking for sort of positive signs, I might offer those two up.
You made a point, Staci, about maybe not being fair to ask Bitcoin to be a hedge for price inflation. Why? Why is that unfair?
Well, I think the idea is that it's a monetary hedge, right? And so Bitcoin, by the way, is not terribly correlated with interest rates, actually. So the Fed was raising interest rates all through 2017, but Bitcoin had a great year in 2017, right? So it's much more correlated with growth in the money supply, growth in economic indicators, sort of, just like demand growth, Bitcoin sort of, and crypto. I know I say Bitcoin as a kind of a catch-all for crypto more generally, including, the better crypto, Algorand, for example, the algo. But these kinds of things, that demand side and that monetary policy side tends to be much more correlated with Bitcoin. And you can think of it in that way then as a hedge for the growth of M2, for the growth of deposits in the economy. And I think that's enough, honestly.
Great. Would you like to make any points?
Yes. So first of all, so I clearly have a different perspective on some of these issues than Staci's.
I love it. It's good when they disagree.
Points that, yes, earnings will be negatively affected when the macro environment is weak, but if the alternative is something that doesn't have any earnings at all, it's not obvious that that is necessarily going to be better. So the question still remains, what is the fundamental valuation model underlying an asset like Bitcoin? And when I look, I don't see an obvious valuation model. So one can think about, use cases for a cryptocurrency and how that generates value. So when I think about something like Ethereum, one might argue that maybe the Ethereum blockchain provides a great deal of smart contract functionality that is going to create intrinsic value. So I think ultimately we may have to think about where the intrinsic value is coming from. Now, certainly, as you've pointed out, there are assets around, including gold, where, yes, you may use gold for maybe tooth fillings for certain industrial uses, but the market value of gold is well above what one might think about as a value based on intrinsic uses. So certainly there are assets out there that do seem to be serving this function, which largely seem to have their prices determined by the notion of scarcity. Gold is scarce. There are physical constraints to mining gold, there are physical constraints to mining Bitcoin, and there is going to be a cap on Bitcoin supply. But again, to an economist, the question really is about whether there is something more durable than scarcity that one can rely upon for value.
Thank you.
This is not the topic of the panel, but I think, over the next 2 days, we'll see a lot of that. What are the use cases? How do you think about it? And I can, of course, rattle off a couple of ways to stick up for crypto and genuine use cases now on this panel. I won't do that unless asked, but I do think that it behooves all of us to double down on these real world use cases going forward. And it's part of this question about, restoring trust and showing that we can live. The promise is absolutely there for us as a broader community, but it behooves us now to really double down on showing what are the real world use cases. And that's, of course, what we're quite focused on at the Algorand Foundation as well. But I think as an ecosystem, we have to really make sure that we talk about that, emphasize that, and do that.
Can I just sort of pick up on that for a moment? Because trust is another word that, always comes up at crypto panels and conferences, and it seems to be a very integral part of the whole debate. How about showing, value? Would that be a different way of approaching this? Why is trust so important? It's not like you get banks going around in a traditional financial system. It doesn't really focus on trust. Why is crypto so focused on trust? Why is that the ultimate sort of, value proposition, if you like? Okay,
well, I'd argue that the genesis of crypto is the fact that you don't need trust, right? That's the whole idea. I mean, it is no coincidence at all when Satoshi Nakamoto, when she wrote that paper, it was at the time, after the global financial crisis, when this didn't happen, oddly, but we were all sure that governments were going to inflate their way out of their problems. I mean, we all expected, I would say, in the market, a period of inflation, and that's when that paper came out. You don't have to, in a Bitcoin framework at the time, you don't have to trust monetary authorities to do the right thing. You don't have to trust your counterparty in your bank to, not take away your bank account when they don't like you, et cetera, et cetera. So what has happened, I think, if I may be so bold, is that in this last year, which has been a terrible year for crypto, of course, but DeFi and pure crypto has held up as advertised throughout the year. It is this kind of, and then regulated entities, of course, are regulated, and regulators come and they look at the books and they look and see what's going on. Where the trouble has been is in this kind of, we call it CeFi land, where you're crypto adjacent, but you're also quite centralized. And so, if you're a creditor on a DeFi platform, we have Folks Finance right here, is one of our biggest DeFi platforms on Algorand. Go talk to him, very nice guy. Benedetto, put your hand up. That collateral liquidates automatically, right? You don't have, your broker doesn't call you and you don't say, I got to take my kid to college this weekend. Can I just have a couple more days? Like, nobody cares. It liquidates and you're fine as a creditor. It's when you have individuals making decisions in centralized entities that talk like they're in crypto, but they're not actually crypto-based. That's where you get into problems, and that's where there was trust that was misplaced, I would say. CZ made this point. The blockchain is quite transparent. You can see transactions, and you can also look at code. Most of the code is open source as well. So you can, it's not easy to do to kind of DYOR, but you can do it in crypto.
So I think there is another way to frame your question, Eva, which might link up with what Staci was saying, which is to think about crypto as an asset class and then the crypto technology, blockchain technology, but other variants thereof that provides, I think, not just decentralized trust, but also true services. So the question is really whether that use case in terms of providing new products, new services, or even new ways of delivering new products and services at scale and in a more efficient way. That creates value. So I think at one level, we do agree on one part that there might be value coming from that part of the ecosystem. But of course, right now, we have this conflation of viewing crypto as an asset class and the issue of services. And also, as Staci pointed out, this very unfortunate outcome that we have what was meant to be a very decentralized ecosystem becoming much more centralized and inheriting all the vulnerabilities that exist in a traditional financial system.
And to kind of, we touched on this slightly earlier, that, crypto promised to be a sort of different asset class, if you like, or to be a different type of financial world than TradFi. And actually, the way it's evolved in recent years, it's very much a similar, just another asset class to trade, right? Is that surprising to either of you? Would you say that this is going to change? Would DeFi be able to operate without central banks?
So,
I will just say, and I only have sort of one sentence to say on this, so that's why I'll go first. Right now, everything is correlated. Like, this panel is titled Macro's Effect on Crypto, but, we don't even know what macro's effect on macro is right now. I mean, it is one trade, really. Everything, it is not just a crypto problem that we have right now. So that was my one sentence.
So again, I want to set aside the notion of crypto as an asset class and think about where the value proposition comes from. Going back to Bitcoin, it was supposed to give us a medium of exchange that did not require a trusted intermediary and that did not require us to in any way involve traditional financial institutions. And what I think has perverted that sense of crypto is the fact that many of those functions, especially the payment function, Bitcoin and decentralized cryptocurrencies of its ilk have not delivered on. They identified a real fundamental need in the financial system, better payment systems both domestically and cross-border. So I think this is why they not only met a need, but also fit into the libertarian zeitgeist of the time. But when you have a very volatile medium of exchange, it does not work that well. So it became what I think it was never intended to do, which is a purely speculative financial asset. But there is a need for better payments. So if you think about stable coins, they are around because they fulfill an important need for better payment systems, especially in the decentralized finance part of the financial ecosystem, but more broadly as well. But then if you think about a stable coin, it gives up every element of decentralization, the decentralized governance, the decentralized consensus, the decentralized architecture. You have a central validator. You have a party that essentially determines who has access to this system. And of course, in the ultimate irony, you get the stable value from being backed up by fiat currencies. So the question is whether this sort of centralization is the way to move forward. I worry that this sort of centralization, again, creates a large number of fragilities in the financial system and doesn't quite deliver upon the promise of decentralization. And I think, as Staci is alluding to, there is a lot of promise in the truly decentralized part of the ecosystem, which has continued. But I think in each of those cases, we need to think about exactly what the value proposition is for users, whether this is necessarily the right technology, the right structure to deliver those services. And in some cases, again, we're getting some innovation, which I think is going to provide some useful purposes.
Okay, I don't quite agree with a lot of that. So, and I haven't written 3 books, but I still will be so bold as to not agree with all of that. First of all, I find it kind of irritating that crypto assets are accused of not being 2 things that they can't be at the same time. So if you look at a bank balance sheet, you're either an asset or you're a deposit, which is a liability. So crypto, but let's just stay with Bitcoin. Bitcoin can either be a means of payment, in which case it should not be volatile, or it can be an asset, in which case it should be volatile. But you can't accuse it for not being both at the same time, right? And they both have very important use cases. So here's your 1-minute lecture on how the gold market works. You go to Sierra Leone, you dig a hole in the ground, you get shot at on the way down, you dig a bunch of gold up, You get shot at on the way up. You put it in a Brinks truck, puts it on an airplane. You get shot at in the airplane. You land in England. You get shot at in London, and you bury it another mile or two down in the ground below the Bank of England. Like, it's kind of ridiculous. And so the idea that you can have digital store of values is very much, it has value to it in an efficiency way, and the idea that you can have digital stores of value, I think, is inherently very important. But as a payments mechanism, I mean, here is, in one sentence, the 101 for me value add of crypto and the blockchain. And that is that the history of financial innovation for the last decade or so has been about improving the messaging that goes back and forth between bank balance sheets, right? It's faster, it's cheaper, it's more efficient now. But still, you are reconciling across bank balance sheets. That's what finance is. But a blockchain, it's one ledger. You're writing to one ledger. There's no sense in which somebody's even sending an algo to somebody else. You're just writing to the same ledger. And that is profound. That is a profound value addition. Somebody in Nigeria can send somebody in Malaysia a movie in 1 minute over WhatsApp. But they can't send $10 without traveling through the correspondent banking system of the United States, clearing at the Fed, traveling back down through the correspondent banking system. In the case of remittances, somebody's taking 5% off the top.
Should they be able to send money, do you think, like that, without any?
I do. Yep. I think that I know where you're going with the AML, KYC. That can happen where you enter the system. And I'm not opposed to that, of course. I will point out, though, that the mirror image of every gangster that's trying to, thwart the law is, a woman in Afghanistan that's trying to keep her hard-earned savings away from husbands and fathers and brothers, right? So it's a more complicated question, I think, that we often realize. But this idea that you're all writing to one place, this is going to cut out billions of dollars of costs in financial intermediaries, and it's a dream that I think is worth hanging on to.
Let's move on a little bit to, well, not really moving on, because we're talking about central banks still, but central bank digital currencies, if we can touch on that for a little part of this session, that would be great. How do you think the development of CBDCs, and if I may say so, the hype around CBDCs, with all the central banks around the world doing it, some kind of a project about it, how will that impact crypto, the little bubble that crypto is, and how will that impact the actual traditional financial system, in your view, perhaps the hierarchy of currencies? Could you give us a few top-line thoughts on that, Eswar, please?
So it's worth thinking about what the motivations are for central banks issuing CBDCs. There are electronic payment systems that work perfectly well in delivering the payment services that people in countries like China, India, advanced economies like Sweden need. So there is a question about whether a central bank really needs to have its money relevant at the retail level. If central banks stopped issuing currency, their money was not used at the retail level, they could still perfectly well do what they do, which goes back to your initial question, Eva, which is manage the cost of funds, especially the cost of interbank borrowing, which is the way they affect the cost of funds in the economy and economic activity. But central banks seem to be viewing it as a path to one of a few things, perhaps broader financial inclusion, a low-cost digital payment system that everybody has easy access to, backstop to a private payments infrastructure, which is a Sweden example. They view the e-krona essentially as ensuring payment system stability, so it's not subject to technological or confidence vulnerabilities. And then, of course, there is China, where Alipay and WeChat Pay are doing a great job of providing payments, but they've been hoovering up a lot of data, stifling competition, and I think the government wants to make sure that there are alternative payment mechanisms that can continue to innovate, that can compete on a level playing field. But in all of these, I think the question really comes down to exactly the same sort of questions that crypto faces, which is what is the user case and what is the value proposition? So in a country like China, which is moving forward with the CBDC experiment, there is a question, why bother with a digital version of the renminbi? Because at least in terms of domestic payments, it's not needed. Everybody has easy access. And in China in particular, Alipay and WeChat Pay have provided these payments at very low cost with very high efficiency and at scale. So even if you're selling a dumpling on a street, you can still use that in a way that is cost effective and efficient. The same question comes up in the context of India. So I think the question will really come down to, if a central bank issues a CBDC, what are the value propositions it can provide relative to a crypto? So if you think about a CBDC coexisting with a stable coin, both are going to be doing essentially the same thing, because a stablecoin essentially is giving you a more effective way of using a fiat currency, but perhaps a stablecoin will have certain types of functionality on decentralized blockchains, which a CBDC may not have. You could envision a CBDC which has programmatic capabilities, but I think central banks are rightly very cautious about moving down that road, because once you start embedding features in a CBDC, you start thinking about different units of central bank money with different characteristics, which I think can fundamentally affect the integrity of central bank money. So I don't think we will quite go there. As for your question about whether it's going to affect traditional finance, yes, it is a significant concern. If we all had access to CBDC digital wallets where you could put large amounts of money, in times of financial turmoil, or even in normal times when interest rates are close to zero, you might decide that keeping money in a central bank-backed account is better than even putting it in a deposit, even if that is insured. You might also see private payments providers essentially being outcompeted by the government. And I think central banks that are moving down the CBDC road are very aware of these concerns. There are potentially design choices, both conceptual and technical, that can mitigate some of these risks, but not eliminate all of them.
Thank you. Staci, how do you view CBDCs?
Yeah, I just say a couple of things about what you said. I think, first of all, your point is a very good one, that the more you try to put rules around money, the less it becomes money. So you have a very tricky situation there from a government point of view. And then second, I don't think governments really want to be in the business of kind of KYC or anything at the retail level, deciding that this is good and you can't shop at liquor stores, but you can at bakeries kind of thing. I mean, I don't think that's on the table necessarily, but it's definitely not a path that they want to go down. And then third, I think the last thing that you mentioned is very real, that if you have emerging markets always suffer from a flight to quality, flight to dollar assets. And so in a time of financial instability, banks are already a little bit vulnerable, and if there's this option to flee out of the banking sector and into the central bank deposit account, you can kind of ironically maybe engender more financial instability, and they're very worried about that, as you noted. I will say, though, that the Fed did a survey of what everybody was most worried about in terms of financial market instability, and crypto came up fifth. I mean, it's kind of crazy to me seeing the sort of minor impact that it actually has on Main Street. It came just below US-China relations and above climate. So, we have a PR, I think, obligation, all of us as well.
I mean, in terms of the interaction of the traditional financial system and crypto, were you surprised that there wasn't more spillover from the crypto world to TradFi, Staci?
I won't say, it's such a small, the financial system is like trillions and trillions of dollars, right? And crypto's about $1 trillion now, so it's just nothing. And, Goldman Sachs did a survey of, I don't remember actually now if it included the FTX debacle or if it was just after sort of the summer's debacles, but the wealth effect is something like 0.3% of wealth, right? I mean, it's really doesn't have much of an impact. Some of the unemployment issues are interesting, though, because I don't want to say for the first time, but it's rare that the unemployment effects are happening with high income earners. So this is like Silicon Valley layoffs and crypto layoffs. It's not more of the wage earners, and this is a little bit new.
Okay, thank you. Eswar, were you surprised by how little spillover there was from crypto to TradFi this year?
So it does seem like the traditional financial institutions have been relatively well insulated, I guess largely because of regulatory constraints and how much they can get into this space. And also, when one thinks about a little over $2 trillion of worth of market value disappearing, that sounds like a lot, but it's not obvious that this is real money in any sense. But what I do worry a little bit about is those who are getting hurt. I mean, perhaps there are many in this room who could take a significant loss. Perhaps CZ can afford to have 10% of his portfolio go to zero, given how large his portfolio is right now. But there are lots of people, I think, who are being drawn into this system that don't fully understand the risks, that may have viewed this as a pathway to economic salvation. And this is true of low-income, low-net worth individuals, low-income, low-net worth countries like El Salvador. And I think that ties to your point about the PR issue. One of the promises of decentralized finance was the notion of the democratization of finance, giving new players, new financial firms, easy access to the financial playing field by allowing them to create new products and services, generate more efficiency gains, and give everybody easy access to those products and services so that even low-income, low-net-worth individuals could get bespoke products created for them. You go into a local office of Goldman Sachs without $1 million in your pocket, they don't give you the time of day. But the idea was that you might get broader financial inclusion. And I've sat at meetings with people from underprivileged communities who about a year ago, actually a year and a half ago, were arguing that crypto should not be regulated too tightly because this is a way that people who are not served by the traditional financial system are finally going to get access. And right now you have many wealthy players benefiting from the rise in the price of Bitcoin. So let us have a chance at this as well. And that has ended pretty badly. And I think what we are struggling with right now in terms of the PR effort is the fact that this democratization of finance is not a proposition that is evident. And what we are seeing is a lot more financial engineering and perhaps people who shouldn't be taking on certain risks getting exposure to these risks. So I think that's where the PR challenge might lie.
Okay, I think that's fair on the financial engineering point, but I think you're also doubling down on my core value proposition point, which is that, this view of like, what's it all for is very much a view from a position of dollar privilege. It's a Western view. And inflation is very bad for crypto in developed countries because it means that central banks are going to step in and they're going to raise interest rates, and that's bad for risk on assets. But inflation is a very good thing for crypto in emerging markets because they don't believe that their central banks, not all emerging markets, but let's just call it that subset of emerging markets, they don't believe that their government is credible enough to do something about it, and so they have to store value in crypto, and they can't. It's a much easier thing to access than it is otherwise. The United States, so Ukraine, for example, they did $100 million in transactions just in the first couple of months of that war, right? The United States has withdrew from Afghanistan. There's a wallet payments provider on Algorand called Hisab Pay. They did, $1 million in transactions in the first 3 months on Hisab Pay. They've got 3,000 merchants on this thing. They have like 320,000 users on this thing. It's because this is providing these countries another access to financial interactions. And in the United States, about 16% of white Caucasians hold crypto, about 18% of African Americans, and about 20% of Latinos. So it is very much viewed as an instrument for financial inclusion. I'm not going to argue that we've got it all right, but I am going to argue that the value proposition is there and it's fundamental to the technology.
Is it a problem, do you think, with the value proposition, or in the sense of the value proposition that people just hold Bitcoin? It's not so much that writing, that they're sending value and, writing in the same sort of spreadsheet, if you like, but they're just sitting on it. So does that not negate the value proposition?
Well, I will go back to my earlier comments about store of value, but I do think that the fact that there are a lot of hodlers on Bitcoin does make the marginal transaction more volatile, right? Because it's bad for liquidity, for sure.
Okay, let's do a couple of hypotheticals for the coming year. Recession, I don't know if you guys read analyst notes. I don't know if I should recommend you do that, maybe not. I'd have to do quite a lot of analyst note reading, and everyone expects a recession this year because of the swift policy path that we've seen, the tightening path. How will that impact crypto, do you think?
So my sense again is that we are seeing things continue to happen in the crypto space because one of the things that are lead up to the recession and the volatility that we've experienced over the last couple of decades has shown is that there are big failings in the financial system. We spoke a little earlier about monetary policy, and monetary policy works through the banking system and the broader part of the financial system. And that part of the system doesn't seem to be working very well in terms of, giving people access to basic financial services to manage credit, risk, savings, and so on. And in addition, it creates, a fulcrum of fragilities. So I think the promise of decentralized finance, that we would get away from those sorts of fragilities, is certainly an important one. And I'm hoping that, in my view, one of the big benefits of crypto, whatever happens to the value of Bitcoin, the value of this entire ecosystem, is that it's really shown a harsh light on the failings of the traditional financial system. Not that these weren't apparent already, but we can see that there are better ways to do even basic elements of business, such as setting up domestic and international payments. In addition, I think it's given both traditional financial institutions and central banks a real kick in the pants to say that we need to be changing. We can't be making these small modifications to get us to a better place. So if nothing else, I think the fact that crypto has catalyzed these discussions is an important thing. And my hope is that progress will continue in the truly decentralized part of the space. But I do worry that, again, there are vulnerabilities in the centralized part of the system that we've seen in the last few months, few weeks, and this could end up becoming the driving narrative. And certainly what the Fed does with interest rates, which might be the force that tips us into recession, is going to have a negative effect on crypto, again, as an asset class, which I would like to maintain the distinction between that and the services it provides.
Personally, I guess I agree with you that we are heading towards a recession, but I don't think that it's a slam dunk, and I don't think that there's a consensus, actually. So I think when you look at sort of the reasons that we may be heading into a recession, you've got, of course, the fact that there's inflation, and the Fed has been very clear about it's going to do something about it, and it's not going to let up. It's interesting that the market doesn't 100% believe them, but for sure, they have been very, very clear about that. If you look at consumer confidence indices, they're down. The manufacturers, the PMI is very, by the way, correlated with Bitcoin, and it is negative now, meaning that the purchasing managers expect a deceleration in activity. And so I think these are all, there's a lot of political nonsense in the United States, for example, as well. So leader McCarthy made a deal with the Hawks in order to get his leadership position. And that means that we are most likely looking at another debt ceiling showdown in the fall. You can also already see this in treasury markets, like the 6-month treasury bill. There's not a lot of demand for it compared to like the 3-month and the longer dated, because nobody wants to be in this paper at that time of year in August, September when that's happening. So these are all, and of course, regulatory uncertainty, and nobody likes kind of the uncertainty. Geopolitical, right? There's a lot of like structural inflationary aspects to, military buildup, lack of globalization, the idea that, you're going to have to be sourcing from home, especially in high-wage countries. These are all things that, make the Fed be vigilant, of course. But on the other side, there are things happening, in particular, like the weakening dollar. This is very good for emerging markets, and particularly those that have debts in dollars. And monetary policy, there's two things to I guess I would say about it. One is that it operates with a lag, right? So you, especially in countries that have a lot of fixed interest obligations, so mortgages, you don't go, selling your house right away and refinance into a higher mortgage rate. You let these things roll off, and so it is not clear that we're seeing all of the negative effects already from monetary policy interest rate rises. But China is opening up. Anyway, there's sort of things to the positive as well.
But it sounds like you're of the camp who expect, like, you're right, you know, inflation expectations for the next, like this time next year, it's 2%, right? So there seems to be some kind of mispricing somewhere because someone is definitely wrong. But do you expect central banks and the Fed in particular to cut and therefore to bail out
Here's what
the world and crypto?
Yeah, here's what I think. Here's what I think will maybe not happen. So real interest rates are negative. They have been negative for the last 10 years, and they are still negative. And that means that the nominal inflation rate is higher than the nominal interest rate. So we are actually in a negative interest rate environment, real interest rate environment. The question is, when we get back to sort of call it monetary policy normalcy, will the Fed ever be able to have interest rates that are positive on a real basis, given the level of indebtedness in the rich countries? So if you look at Japan, you look at the US, you look at Europe, there's public and private sector debt combined is something like 400% of GDP. So will they have the balls, excuse my language, to actually raise real interest rates? And I'm not sure that they do. And so at that point, I think they may start to back off, and then we'll start seeing some maybe relief. But I don't think before that.
Eswar, do you think that the central bank will ultimately come and, you know, do what it's done in the past 10 years and, you know, keep bailing out the world?
One hopes it may not come to that. As Staci pointed out, there is, you know, a view of the world that, in fact, we could end up with, you know, maybe a mild recession, a significant slowdown of economic activity without necessarily tipping into a huge recession. But what happens to the financial system is really crucial in all of this. Now, during the COVID period, the financial system in most countries actually held up quite well. So that didn't become a source of instability in and of itself. My sense is that if the need were to arise, if there were to be significant financial market distress events, either in the advanced economies or more broadly, then you could have central banks stepping in. But I think they're very focused on the real economy part of their mandate right now.
Thank you. And just a sort of very last-minute question to you with very brief answers, please. What do you expect 2023 to be the year for crypto? Is it the year of growth, building, you know, wilting? Choose a word that you think will be appropriate.
It's the year of Algorand.
I
really walked into that one, didn't I?
I have more than one word. I think in terms of crypto as an asset class, it's going to remain highly volatile. In terms of decentralized finance and the progress there, I hope that it will continue. In terms of regulation, I see a much more unfavorable environment, although in the long term, that could end up being good for crypto, both as an asset class and as a technology.
And if I could just have one last word, I would say The Future of Money by Eswar Prasad is an amazing book, and I recommend to all of you to please pick it up, and you will enjoy it and you will learn a lot from it.
Thank you, Staci.
And on that note, thank you so much for listening. I hope that was useful, and we'll see you at the Q&A bubble. Thank you so much.